Welcome back to the Silly Kitchen. We are talking food photography and using your camera on manual. This video is the second video in the series of all the different ways to have more control and get the results that you want in your food photos. So let's go. If you watched the previous video, which I hope you did, we talked about aperture and that depth of field and getting that blurry versus that sharp kind of background coming into play. Today, we are going to talk about the shutter speed. So on your camera, usually there's a little dial on a Canon like this that you can set your shutter. And your shutter can go slow, where it just opens and closes. Or it could go, and that's what you hear when you click your camera on and off. When you click that shutter, it goes, and if you set it, at like 1/60th of a second, you'll hear it go a little bit slower. If you set it at 1/200th of a second, it'll go a little faster. But what does that all mean? Well, if you kind of think about what I just did with my arms with the shutter, the slower that goes, the more time when it's open you have in that to allow light to come in. You're also going slower, and if there's any kind of motion or movement or something happening, it's gonna capture a longer time frame of that movement happening. Does that make sense? Yes? Okay. So if we go faster, what does that mean? That means there's less time for light to come in, so your image will be darker than if it's a slower one. And also with the movement now, coming back to that, if let's say we're doing, let's use an example of like pouring syrup, or maybe you're throwing a pancake up in the air. I don't know why I'm talking about pancakes. I must be hungry for sweets. But let's say you're pouring syrup. So if you want that pour to be visually kind of seen in your shot as an action in that kind of split second of a photo, then that slow shutter is kind of going to show a blurry kind of pour. If you're going to go faster, it's going to quickly kind of capture that millisecond of that syrup being poured. And maybe that's a good example for food photography, but maybe an easier comparison would be like a waterfall. If you've ever seen photos of waterfalls where it just looks like really blurry and fuzzy and like it's actually moving, that's because it was done on a slower shutter speed. Whereas if you can kind of see all the droplets and little lines and things like that, that might have been done on a faster shutter speed. So now, based on what I was saying about that speed and that open and close, the other thing you got to think about is if you put that number, that shutter speed, at a low number, and you let that shutter kind of stay open and closed longer, what that also means is that you're holding a heavy camera. So if that shutter's going very slowly and your hand has a little shake to it, which for me, like, that's a long time to stay perfectly still, you're gonna actually see a bit of that shake in kind of blurriness in that photo. So you'll have to kind of figure out in play where your hand and where your kind of comfortable spot is of not seeing that shake. I literally think 100 is probably where 125 is probably where I would feel most comfortable with Handshake for me. And then other than that, I would put it on a tripod to make sure that there is zero movement when I'm taking a slower shutter type photo. So just keep that in mind. Again, if you're maybe working on a very slow shutter speed and you're seeing things aren't as in focus and the whole image is a little bit blurry, you might need to get a tripod out or up that shutter speed a little bit, depending what style and what you're looking for. So does that make sense? We've talked about kind of that blurriness, that sharpness, and now we're talking about how much light and movement will come into your photo. And that's kind of the two big parts of kind of setting up your shot. The next part is gonna be ISO. We're gonna talk about that in the next video. I'll link it below, and that's gonna be the third part of the series, so I hope you stay tuned and go watch that. If you're super confused, maybe go back to the aperture video, rewatch this, ask me questions in the comments, and hopefully I can clarify and give you some tips if you need any.